I stood frozen by the punch bowl, my graduation cap still perched awkwardly on my head, as my mother's voice carried clearly across our backyard. The party guests, family, neighbors, my favorite teachers, all shifted uncomfortably as she gestured toward my acceptance letter to state while holding up my sister's Harvard diploma. 12 years of straight A's, of science fairs, of debate team captaincy, of trying to make her proud, all dismissed with a single champagne-loosened sentence. She'll never be as smart as her sister. The honor cords around my neck suddenly felt like they were choking me as my sister caught my eye from across the lawn, her face a mirror of my own humiliation. Time seemed to slow as the words hung in the air. Aunt Judy looked down at her plate. Mr. Peterson, my AP English teacher who had written such a glowing college recommendation, suddenly became very interested in the ice melting in his drink. No one spoke, but their silence said everything. "Mom," Kate finally called from across the yard, her voice strained. But it was too late. The damage was done. I set down my untouched cup of punch with shaking hands and walked woodenly toward the house, avoiding eye contact with the guests who had come to celebrate my high school graduation. Behind me, I could hear my mother continuing, her voice carrying that familiar tone of resigned disappointment. "Emily's always been more creative. Not academic like Kate. We're just glad State has that communications program. It's more her speed." I closed the sliding glass door behind me, muffling her voice but not the burning shame spreading through my chest. In the quiet of the kitchen, I gripped the counter and tried to steady my breathing. 12 years of being compared to Kate, of never quite measuring up, and now this public declaration on what was supposed to be my day. The door slid open behind me. "Emily." My mother's voice was softer now, perhaps realizing she had crossed a line. "Why did you walk away? Everyone's asking where you went." I turned to face her, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You just told everyone I'm not as smart as Kate. At my graduation party." She waved a dismissive hand, the ice in her glass tinkling. "Oh, don't be so sensitive. I was just explaining the different schools. Kate went to Harvard, you're going to State. It's just facts." "No," I said, finding my voice. "You said I'll never be as smart as her. Those were your exact words." My mother sighed, the sound I'd heard 1,000 times when I'd brought home an A instead of an A, or placed second in a competition instead of first. "Emily, it's not a criticism. Some people are academic, some aren't. Kate got the academic genes. You got other qualities." "What qualities, Mom? What exactly do you think I'm good at?" The question hung between us, one I'd wanted to ask for years. She looked momentarily taken aback, then her expression softened into something like pity. "You're sociable. Good with people. Creative. Those are valuable too, in their own way." The condescension in her voice made each compliment feel like another indictment. Before I could respond, the door slid open again and Kate stepped in, still in her bridesmaid-like dress from the party. "Mom, people are asking where you went," she said, her eyes darting between us. "We're just having a little chat," my mother replied, patting my arm as if the conversation was resolved. "Emily's being sensitive about schools again." Kate winced but said nothing. Her silence another small betrayal in a lifetime of them. She'd never defended me against our mother's comparisons, never corrected the narrative that she was the smart one and I was whatever was left over. "I'm not being sensitive," I said, removing my graduation cap and placing it deliberately on the counter. "I'm telling you that what you said hurt me. What you've been saying for years hurts me." My mother's expression hardened. "Well, I'm sorry if the truth hurts. But coddling you won't prepare you for the real world." With that, she brushed past me back toward the party, leaving Kate and me alone in the kitchen. My sister took a step toward me, her face a mixture of guilt and discomfort. She didn't mean it the way it sounded," she offered weakly. "Yes, she did," I replied, untying the honor cords from around my neck. "And you know it. You've always known it." I placed the cords next to my cap and walked upstairs to my bedroom, closing the door on the sounds of my graduation party continuing without me. Through the window, I could see guests mingling in forced cheerfulness, my mother once again holding court in that moment, staring down at the celebration of my achievement that had so quickly become another reminder of my perceived inadequacy. I made a decision. My mother's assessment of my intelligence, my worth, my potential, none of it would define me anymore. I was done trying to prove myself to someone who had already decided who I was. The comparison began before I could even understand what it meant. Kate was 4 when I was born, already reading simple books and impressing adults with her precocious vocabulary. Family videos show her reciting the alphabet backward while I gurgled in the background, our mother's voice narrating. Kate's showing Emily how it's done, but I think we have different kinds of girls here. Different kinds of girls. The euphemism followed me through childhood like a shadow. Kate brought home perfect report cards, won the regional spelling bee in 4th grade, scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests. I brought home art projects, joined the theater club, wrote stories that my teachers praised for their creativity and emotional depth. But creativity didn't register on my mother's scale of success. Your sister was already reading at a college level by your age, she'd say when I struggled with a particularly dense book for English class. Or Kate never needed a tutor for math. When I asked for help with geometry, even well-intentioned comments carried the sting of comparison. It's nice that you enjoy art so much. Not everyone can be academically gifted like your sister. My father, when he was still around, had been my buffer. Emily sees the world differently, he'd say. That's valuable too. But after the divorce, his defenses became weakened encouragements that couldn't stand against my mother's daily assessments. By middle school, I had internalized the narrative so completely that I stopped showing my mother my achievements unless they were academic. The short story that won a regional contest? Hidden in my desk drawer. The lead role in the school play? I told her the rehearsals were for a study group. Then came high school, and with it a determined effort to prove her wrong. I pushed myself relentlessly: AP classes, debate team, student government, science Olympiad. I studied until my eyes burned, wrote and rewrote essays until they blurred on the page, raised my hand in every class even when my heart pounded with anxiety. The results were undeniable. Straight A's, honor roll, class rank in the top 10%. Not Kate's valedictorian status, but close. Surely enough to prove I was smart too. But the goalposts kept moving. Kate did it while also volunteering 20 hours a week, my mother pointed out. Or your sister took 9 AP classes, not just 5. Or worst of all, it's wonderful how hard you try, Emily. How hard you try. As if my achievements were merely the result of effort rather than ability. As if I were compensating for some fundamental deficiency that Kate didn't have. The pattern became clearer when I found old photos of my mother with her own sister, my Aunt Judith. In yellowed pictures from their graduation, my mother, always so confident, so certain of her assessments, stood slightly apart, her smile tight, while my grandmother beamed at Judith. Your grandmother always thought Judith was the smart one, my mother admitted once, in a rare moment of vulnerability. She went to medical school while I became a teacher. Mom never let me forget it. The revelation should have fostered empathy between us. Instead, it seemed to justify her behavior. She had survived being the less than sister, so I would too. Kate, for her part, tried in small ways to bridge the gap. She helped me with homework when our mother wasn't looking. She nominated me for a school leadership award my junior year. But she never directly challenged the narrative our mother had created, that she was the intellectual and I was something else. You know, Mom doesn't mean anything by it, she'd say after particularly pointed comparisons. She just wants you to reach your potential. But whose vision of my potential? Certainly not mine. By senior year, I'd achieved what even my mother couldn't dismiss: acceptance to 3 solid state universities with partial scholarships, class rank of 7th out of 300 students, captain of the debate team, editor of the school literary magazine. For a brief moment, I thought it would be enough, that my graduation would finally be the acknowledgement that I too was intelligent, capable, worthy of the same pride she took in Kate. Then came the party, the punch bowl, and the public declaration that confirmed what I had suspected all along. In my mother's eyes, I would always be the lesser sister. No achievement would ever close the gap between Kate's Harvard diploma and whatever I managed to accomplish. The worst part wasn't even my mother's words. It was realizing how completely I had organized my life around proving her wrong, choosing activities not because I loved them but because they might impress her, pursuing goals not because they called to me but because they resembled Kate's path. Somewhere along the way, in trying to show my mother I was smart enough, I had lost sight of who I actually was and what I actually wanted. That night, after the party guests had gone and the backyard fell silent, I sat alone in my room surrounded by the artifacts of my achievements, medals, certificates, honor cords, college acceptance letters, and wondered for the first time, what would I have done differently if I hadn't been trying to be Kate? The summer after graduation unfolded in tense silence. My mother attempted no apology, instead acting as if the party incident had never happened. When I remained distant, she labeled me sulky and dramatic, further confirmation in her mind that I lacked Kate's emotional maturity. Kate returned to Boston for her summer internship 2 weeks after my graduation, leaving me alone with our mother in a house that felt suddenly too small. Without my sister as a buffer or a measuring stick, my mother found new ways to make comparisons. Kate's firm is already talking about bringing her on full-time after she finishes her master's, she mentioned over breakfast, scrolling through her phone. What exactly does that communications program at State prepare you for anyway? I poked at my cereal appetite. Gone. Marketing, public relations, journalism. There are lots of options. She made a non-committal noise. Well, it's good to have options, I suppose. Though Kate knew exactly what she wanted to do by your age, each interaction followed the same pattern. A comment about Kate's certainty, achievement, or intelligence, followed by an implicit question about my own direction. By July, I had started avoiding home altogether, picking up extra shifts at my summer job at the bookstore downtown, and volunteering at the community theater. You're quiet lately, observed Diane, the theater's artistic director, as we sorted through costume donations. Everything okay with college plans? I hesitated, then found myself spilling the whole story. The party, the years of comparison, the uncertainty I now felt about my abilities and choices. Diane listened without interruption, her hands continuing to fold and sort. When I finished, she nodded once. My mother was the same way with my brother and me. He was the smart one too. How did you deal with it? I asked. Badly at first, she admitted. I tried to prove her wrong until I burned myself out. Then I finally realized something important. She looked up from the costumes. Her assessment was never really about me. It was about her. Her values, her insecurities, her need to categorize people to make sense of the world. The insight settled in my chest, both painful and freeing. So what did you do? I stopped trying to disprove her assessment and started figuring out who I actually was. She smiled slightly. Turns out I'm pretty damn smart. Just not in the way she measured intelligence. The conversation stayed with me as August approached, bringing with it the looming transition to college. I began to notice how deeply my mother's comparisons had affected my decision-making. I had chosen State partly because it was close to home, allowing me to continue seeking her approval. I had selected communications as my major because it seemed like something I could excel at without directly competing with Kate's economics degree. Even my dorm decorations reflected the pattern. I had instinctively chosen items that mirrored Kate's freshman year aesthetic rather than things I actually liked. The realization was both illuminating and crushing. How much of my life had been built around this futile quest for maternal validation? A week before move-in day, Kate called from Boston. Our conversations had been superficial since the party, carefully avoiding any mention of our mother's comment. "How's packing going?" she asked, her voice forcibly cheerful. "Fine," I replied, surveying the half-filled boxes in my room. "Just figuring out what to bring." A pause then. I'm sorry about what Mom said at your party. I should have said something right away." The acknowledgement I had waited for all summer, but it felt hollow now, too little too late. "Why didn't you?" I asked quietly. Kate's sigh carried through the phone. "It's complicated. Mom's always. You know how she is. When she gets like that, contradicting her just makes it worse." "Worse for who? For her? Or for you?" Another pause, longer this time. "I guess I've never really thought about it that way." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but something had changed between us. For the first time, I had challenged the family dynamic directly, naming the pattern that had shaped both our lives. 2 days later, my former debate coach emailed about an opportunity. The university's media relations office was looking for a student assistant, and he'd recommended me based on my communications skills. It would be a great foot in the door for someone interested in strategic messaging, he wrote. When I mentioned it to my mother, her response was predictable. "Are you sure you can handle a job your first semester?" Kate waited until spring term to start working on campus. What was different was my reaction. Instead of the familiar doubt, I felt a flash of anger. Actually, I said, I've already applied. The interview is during orientation week. Her surprise was evident. Well, don't be disappointed if it doesn't work out. Freshman year is about finding your footing academically. That evening, I sat at my desk and created 2 lists. The first contained all the activities, interests, and subjects I had genuinely enjoyed, separate from any comparison to Kate. The second listed the things I had pursued primarily to prove my intelligence to my mother. The results were revealing. My authentic interests clustered around storytelling, visual communication, and persuasive messaging, areas where I had natural strengths that had nothing to do with traditional academic metrics. As I finished packing that week, I made deliberate choices, keeping the debate trophies but discarding the science fair ribbons I had won through joyless persistence, bringing the creative writing journals but leaving behind the calculus textbook I had studied obsessively to match Kate's math scores. Small acts of separation, of defining myself on my own terms. The night before leaving for college, I overheard my mother on the phone with Aunt Judith. Emily's still upset about some comment I made at her graduation party, she said. She's always been the sensitive one, not emotionally resilient like Kate. In that moment, I understood that Diane had been right. My mother's assessments were never truly about me. They were about her own rigid definitions of intelligence and success, definitions that had been imposed on her and that she now imposed on her daughters. The realization didn't heal the wound of that public humiliation, but it gave me something equally valuable: perspective. As I closed my bedroom door for the last time as a full-time resident of that house, I made a promise to myself that I would build a college experience based not on proving my mother wrong, but on discovering who Emily Walker actually was when she wasn't being compared to her sister. State University sprawled across rolling hills, its red brick buildings a stark contrast to the ivy-covered walls of Harvard I'd seen in Kate's photos. My dorm room was small but private, a scholarship perk I hadn't told my mother about, knowing she would compare it to Kate's freshman triple. Fresh start. I whispered to myself, taping a blank poster board above my desk. This would become my evidence board, though not the kind featuring in crime shows. This investigation was more personal. My first week passed in orientation activities and settling in. The interview for the media relations position went better than expected. The director seemed impressed by my debate background and writing samples. When she offered me the job on the spot, I accepted without the reflexive "let me think about it" that usually preceded my decisions. "You seem like a natural fit for strategic communications," she remarked. That analytical-creative combination is surprisingly rare. Analytical-creative combination. The phrase lingered in my mind as I walked back to my dorm. Was it possible to be both? My mother had always presented intelligence as a linear spectrum with Kate at one end and me somewhere in the middle, reaching but never quite arriving. That evening, I began my investigation in earnest. On the blank poster board, I wrote "evidence of intelligence" at the top, then divided it into categories: academic, creative, social, emotional, practical. Under each, I forced myself to list concrete examples from my own life: achievements, moments of insight, problems solved, connections made. The academic column filled quickly with grades and test scores, the metrics my mother valued most. But as I worked through the other categories, a more complex picture emerged. My ability to read a room and adjust my communication style accordingly. The short story that had made my English teacher cry. The time I had negotiated a tricky conflict in the debate club that even the faculty advisor couldn't resolve. Next, I turned to research. The university library yielded books on multiple intelligence theory, cognitive diversity, and educational psychology. I learned about different learning styles, about the limitations of IQ testing, about how traditional education often favors certain types of thinkers over others. I explored the concept of emotional intelligence and recognized my own strengths in that area. I read about visual spatial intelligence and remembered how easily I had always grasped design concepts. I discovered research suggesting that creative problem solving was just as valuable as analytical thinking in many professional contexts, perhaps even more so in an increasingly automated world. Each discovery went onto the board, creating a constellation of evidence that directly contradicted my mother's simplistic assessment. "This is fascinating," said my roommate Layla, pausing to study my growing display. "Is it for a psychology class?" "Personal project," I replied. a little self-conscious about the scope of my investigation. "Huh," she said, tilting her head. "You know what this reminds me of? When scientists have to prove something that's already obvious to everyone except the people in charge." Her casual observation hit with unexpected force. Was my intelligence already obvious to everyone except my mother? Had I internalized her comparative framework so completely that I needed empirical evidence of my own capabilities? To find out, I began talking to people who had known me before college, former teachers, debate teammates, my theater director. Their assessments were startlingly consistent. I was insightful, articulate, conceptually sophisticated, excellent at synthesizing information from different sources. "You were always one of the most intelligent students in class," my AP English teacher told me during a phone call. Not just in the conventional sense of memorizing information, but in making connections others missed. When I mentioned my mother's comment at graduation, he sighed. Unfortunately, some parents have very narrow definitions of intelligence, usually because of how they were measured themselves. The investigation took an unexpected turn when I found an old family photo album in a box I'd packed at the last minute. There, in faded snapshots, was evidence of an earlier Emily, around 7 or 8, building elaborate structures with blocks, creating intricate stories with dolls, convincing neighborhood kids to perform in backyard plays I had written and directed. In one particularly telling image, I stood proudly beside a science fair project on color perception, not the biology project my mother had pushed for, but a clever exploration of how colors affect emotion and decision-making. A perfect integration of scientific method and creative thinking. What had happened to that confident child? When had I started measuring myself solely against Kate's academic yardstick? The answer came from an unexpected source. My media relations supervisor assigned me to interview a visiting cognitive science professor for the university website. As we discussed his research on learning differences, I shared a bit about my own investigation. "Your mother likely has what we call a fixed mindset about intelligence," he explained. "She believes it's a static quality, you either have it or you don't. And she's using a very specific type of academic achievement as her only measure." He sketched a quick diagram on his notepad. "But intelligence is multifaceted and developmental. Your areas of strength may manifest differently than your sister's, but they're no less valuable or indicative of cognitive capacity." As my investigation neared the midpoint of the semester, the evidence board had transformed from a collection of defensive proof to a map of self-discovery. The question was no longer whether I was intelligent. The evidence overwhelmingly confirmed that I was in multiple domains, but why my mother's narrow definition had been allowed to overshadow all other measures for so long. And more importantly, what I was going to do about it. Professor Winter's cognitive psychology class became the unexpected cornerstone of my strategy. 3 times a week, I sat in the lecture hall learning about how the brain processes information, how beliefs form and calcify, and how family dynamics shape self-perception. Changing someone else's deeply held beliefs is nearly impossible, Professor Winters explained during office hours when I described my situation. But you can change how those beliefs affect you. Together we outlined a multifaceted approach, not to convince my mother she was wrong, but to build my own resilience against her assessments while creating space for a different kind of relationship. First came the cognitive reframing exercises. Each time my mother's voice echoed in my mind, "She'll never be as smart as her sister," I would deliberately counter it with specific evidence from my investigation. Not vague affirmations but concrete examples. My A on Professor Chen's notoriously difficult media analysis paper, the director's praise of my strategic thinking, the complex visualization I had created for a client that translated abstract data into compelling narrative. Next, I developed scripts for setting boundaries during family interactions. Simple phrases practiced until they became automatic. "I'm not comfortable with comparisons between Kate and me. I'd prefer to discuss my accomplishments on their own terms. That comment feels dismissive of my different strengths." The third element involved selective engagement, choosing when and how to interact with my mother, based on the likelihood of positive outcomes, rather than familial obligation. This meant shorter phone calls, scheduled around times when I felt emotionally equipped to maintain boundaries, and visits home broken into manageable segments. The goal isn't to cut ties, advised the university counselor I'd started seeing bi-weekly. It's to engage from a position of self-knowledge and strength, rather than vulnerability and need for approval. As Thanksgiving approached, bringing with it the first extended family interaction since graduation, I refined my strategy further. I would arrive with a clear set of achievements to share: my media relations position, my academic success, my growing portfolio, presented not for validation but as simple statements of fact. I would use the communication techniques I'd learned to redirect conversations away from comparisons. I would create natural alliances with relatives who recognized my strengths. And most importantly, I would have an exit plan for moments when boundaries were crossed. Remember, my counselor emphasized, you're not responsible for changing your mother's perception. You're responsible for protecting your well-being and developing an authentic sense of self. The night before heading home, I sat cross-legged on my bed and opened my laptop to a video call with Kate. Our conversations had grown more frequent and substantive since the semester began, evolving from cautious small talk to increasingly honest exchanges. I'm nervous about tomorrow, I admitted after we'd covered the basics of travel plans. It's the first time seeing Mom since everything happened. Kate's expression softened. I've been thinking a lot about that day, Em. About all the days, really. She hesitated. I should have said something. Not just at the party, but years ago. Why didn't you? She looked away briefly, gathering her thoughts. It was easier not to. When Mom focused on comparing us, she wasn't focused on all the ways I wasn't measuring up to her expectations either. This was new information. Kate feeling inadequate despite being the smart one in our mother's narrative. She's always been deeply insecure about her own intelligence, Kate continued. Aunt Judith was the academic star, and Mom never got over it. So she attached herself to my achievements as proof of something. Her genetic contribution, maybe. Her parenting. I don't know. The insight aligned perfectly with what I'd learned in my investigation, but hearing it from Kate gave it new weight. How do you handle it? I asked. Not well for a long time, she admitted. I became what she needed me to be. The perfect student, the Harvard graduate, the successful daughter she could brag about. She smiled ruefully. It's only recently that I've started figuring out what I actually want versus what I was programmed to want. We talked for another hour, sharing strategies and setting loose plans for supporting each other during the holiday. For the first time, I felt like Kate and I were truly allies rather than unwilling competitors in our mother's comparative framework. The final piece of my strategy fell into place the day before Thanksgiving when Professor Chan requested my media visualization project for a conference presentation. Your approach is exactly what I've been trying to explain to my colleagues, he said. This balance of analytical rigor and creative communication is the future of effective media strategy. With his permission, I printed a copy of the project along with his comments, not as a shield or a desperate proof of worth, but as a genuine representation of my unique intellectual strengths. As I packed my bag for the trip home, I reviewed my strategy one last time. I was not returning as the daughter desperately seeking approval, or the sister living in Kate's shadow. I was arriving as Emily Walker, a young woman with distinct capabilities, clear boundaries, and a growing understanding of her own worth. I was ready to execute the plan that would transform not just how my mother saw me, but more importantly, how I saw myself. The familiar drive from the train station to my childhood home felt different somehow, the same winding roads and autumn-bare trees, but viewed through new eyes. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel of my mother's car, which she had left for me at the station, and rehearsed my boundary statements one last time. Emily. Finally. My mother greeted me at the door with her characteristic mix of criticism and affection. Kate's been here since last night. We were beginning to wonder if you'd make it. Begin as you mean to continue, I reminded myself. My train was on schedule, Mom. I arrived exactly when I said I would. If she noticed the subtle pushback, she didn't acknowledge it. Well, come in. Your sister's been telling us about her new research position. It sounds fascinating. Inside, Kate sat at the kitchen island with our aunt and uncle, cradling a mug of tea. She caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging nod. Hi, she said, standing to hug me. I saved you some of the good tea, that vanilla chai you like. A simple gesture but meaningful, Kate acknowledging my preference rather than assuming we shared the same taste, as our mother always did. Thanks, I replied, genuinely appreciative. How's the new position going? For the next hour, I implemented the first phase of my strategy: active engagement on my own terms. I asked Kate specific questions about her work, demonstrating genuine interest while subtly establishing my own understanding of complex research concepts. I shared selective details about my media relations role when asked, focusing on the aspects that showcase my strategic thinking and creative problem-solving. When my mother inevitably began her comparative narrative, "Kate's research team is so prestigious, they only accept the top candidates," I calmly deployed my prepared response. "I'm really happy for Kate's success," I said evenly. "My position at the Media Relations Office is giving me valuable experience in my own field." My mother blinked, momentarily thrown by my refusal to engage with the implied comparison. "Well, yes, I suppose any work experience is good at your level." "It's not just good experience, Mom," Kate interjected, surprising all of us. "Emily's developing skills that are highly sought after in the communications industry. Her supervisor contacted me last week about a potential collaboration between our departments." My mother's eyebrows rose. "You two are working together?" "Potentially," Kate replied, catching my eye. "Emily's visualization methods could help make our research more accessible to non-academic audiences." It was the first time I could remember Kate actively redirecting our mother's attention to my strengths. The moment passed quickly, but I felt its significance like a shift in atmospheric pressure. The real test came during Thanksgiving dinner itself, with extended family around the table and my mother's social performance in full swing. As expected, she began by highlighting Kate's achievements to our relatives. "Kate's department head says she might be the youngest team leader they've ever had," she announced, passing the mashed potatoes. "Harvard certainly prepared her well." I took a deliberate breath and implemented the next phase of my strategy: setting direct boundaries. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm, "I'd appreciate it if we could discuss Kate's accomplishments and mine separately, not as comparisons." A moment of startled silence fell around the table. My mother's expression flickered between confusion and defensiveness. "I was just sharing good news," she said. "There's no need to be sensitive about it." "It's not about sensitivity," I replied. "It's about respect. When you constantly compare us, it diminishes both of our unique paths." My Uncle Brian, always the family peacemaker, jumped in. "Emily's right, Margaret. Both your daughters are accomplished in different ways. I'd love to hear more about Emily's university experience." For a brief moment, I thought my mother might argue or dismiss the redirection. Instead, she pressed her lips together and nodded tightly. "Of course. Emily, tell everyone about your communications program." The slight emphasis on communications carried her usual implication that it was less rigorous than Kate's field, but it was still an opening. I took it, describing not just my courses but the media relations position, the visualization project, and Professor Chen's interest in my work. As I spoke, I noticed my relative's genuine interest: Aunt Judith asking insightful questions about visual information design, my cousin Michael sharing how his company had recently hired someone specifically for strategic communications. "That visualization approach you described is exactly what my department needs," Michael said. "We have all this data that no one understands except the analysts. Would you be interested in looking at some of our materials over the weekend? Paid consultation, of course." Before I could answer, my mother interjected. "Oh, Michael, Emily's just a freshman. You need someone with actual experience for something like that." Here it was, the moment to execute the most challenging part of my strategy: direct contradiction with evidence. "Actually," I said, reaching for my bag beside the chair, "I've already done similar work professionally." I pulled out the portfolio containing my visualization project and Professor Chen's comments. "This is being presented at a media conference next month as an example of innovative approach to data communication." As the portfolio made its way around the table, with appreciative comments from my relatives, I watched something shift in my mother's expression, not quite recognition or acceptance, but a momentary uncertainty, as if a fundamental assumption was being challenged. Kate caught my eye from across the table and gave me a subtle thumbs up. When the portfolio reached her, she added her own endorsement. "Emily has always had this ability to translate complex ideas into accessible formats," she said. "Even in high school, she could explain difficult concepts more clearly than anyone else." My mother watched this exchange with an unreadable expression. When the portfolio finally reached her, she flipped through it quickly, her eyes skimming rather than reading. "Well," she said, returning it to me, "it's certainly creative." The dismissive tone would have crushed me months earlier. Now, I recognized it for what it was: her inability to integrate new evidence that contradicted her established narrative. "It's actually both creative and analytical," I corrected gently. "That's what makes it effective." Michael, sensing the tension, steered the conversation toward safer family topics. But something fundamental had shifted at that table. I had presented clear evidence of my capabilities, set boundaries around comparisons, and refused to accept dismissive characterizations, all without anger or defensiveness. Later, as we cleared the dishes, Kate bumped my shoulder gently. "That was impressive, Em." "What was?" "Standing your ground without burning bridges." She lowered her voice. "I'm still learning how to do that with her." As the evening wound down, my mother made one last attempt to reassert her narrative, telling Aunt Judith within my hearing, "Kate was always the academically gifted one, but Emily's finding her way." Before the familiar hurt could take root, I remembered Professor Winter's words. "You're not responsible for changing your mother's perception. You're responsible for protecting your well-being and developing an authentic sense of self." I chose not to respond to the comment directly. Instead, I accepted Michael's consultation offer, arranged to send him samples on Monday, and engaged Aunt Judith in a conversation about her upcoming book club selection. Active choices that reinforce my agency rather than my mother's narrative. The execution of my strategy wasn't perfect. There were moments of doubt, old patterns reasserting themselves, brief stings when my mother's dismissals hit vulnerable spots. But by the end of that first evening home, I had established a new dynamic, one where comparisons were challenged, boundaries were set, and my unique intelligence was visible to anyone willing to see it. It was just the beginning of a longer process, but it was a beginning entirely of my own making. The final morning of Thanksgiving break found my mother and me alone in the kitchen, the silence broken only by the gentle clink of coffee mugs and the rustle of newspaper pages. Kate had left early for a meeting in Boston, and for the first time in days, there was no buffer between us. "Your consultation with Michael seems to have gone well," my mother observed, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "He's always been generous with opportunities for family." The implication was clear. My cousin had hired me out of kindness, not merit. 6 months ago, I would have accepted this framing, grateful for even this backhanded acknowledgement. Today, I set down my mug and turned to face her directly. "Actually, Mom, Michael extended my consultation because the work I delivered solved a communication problem his department had been struggling with for months." She glanced up, momentarily startled by my directness. "Well, yes, I'm sure it was helpful." "It wasn't just helpful," I continued, my voice steady. "It demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical and creative intelligence I've been developing throughout my education, the kind you've consistently overlooked." Her pencil went still against the newspaper. "Emily, I don't think this attitude is productive." "This isn't attitude, Mom. It's truth." I took a deep breath, centering myself for what needed to be said. "At my graduation party, you told everyone I would never be as smart as Kate. That wasn't an isolated comment. It was just the most public version of a message you've been sending me my entire life." My mother's posture stiffened. "I've only ever wanted what's best for you. If that occasionally meant highlighting areas where you could improve." "It wasn't about improvement," I interrupted gently. "It was about comparison. About measuring me against a standard that was never mine to begin with." "That's simply not true." Her voice took on the defensive edge I recognized from countless previous conversations. "I've supported both you girls equally." "Have you?" I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I documented specific instances. Dates, contexts, exact quotes spanning years of subtle and not-so-subtle comparisons. "Would you like me to read these to you?" She stared at the phone as if it were a weapon. "You've been keeping track? That seems rather calculated." I needed to understand the pattern, I explained, to see clearly what was happening instead of just feeling it. A heavy silence fell between us. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and fell quiet. My mother folded her newspaper with deliberate precision, buying time. "Your Aunt Judith called," she said finally, changing tactics. She was quite impressed with your work. Always had a soft spot for you. Mom, I said, refusing to be diverted. We need to talk about this. About how your constant comparisons have affected me. About how they're still affecting our relationship. Something flickered across her face. Discomfort, perhaps, or recognition. I suppose Kate has been filling your head with complaints about me. This isn't about Kate. It's about you and me. I leaned forward slightly. Did you know I almost didn't join debate team because you said I wouldn't be as good at it as Kate was? That I dropped advanced biology despite loving it because you compared my first test score to her final grade? Do you realize how many of my choices have been responses to your assessments? My mother's hands trembled slightly as she aligned the newspaper's edges. Parents guide their children. That's our job. Guidance isn't the same as comparison, I said quietly. One helps us find our path. The other makes us lose sight of it entirely. For a moment, I thought she might retreat into defensiveness again. Instead, something unexpected happened. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid facade cracking. My mother, she began, then stopped. Started again. Your grandmother had very clear ideas about intelligence. Academic achievement was everything. Judith was her star. National Merit Scholar, valedictorian, medical school. Her voice took on a bitter edge. I was the pretty one. The social one. Never quite serious enough for real intellectual pursuits. The parallel was so obvious it felt almost heavy-handed. My grandmother's treatment of my mother mirroring her treatment of me. The cycle continuing across generations. That must have been painful, I acknowledged. She shrugged, a gesture that failed to disguise decades of hurt. I learned to find my strengths elsewhere. But you still believed her assessment, I pressed gently. You still accepted her definition of intelligence as the only valid one. My mother looked up, her eyes meeting mine with rare vulnerability. I suppose I did. And then you applied it to Kate and me. She didn't deny it. For several moments we sat in silence, the weight of recognition hanging between us. I never meant to hurt you, she said finally. I know. I reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. But understanding the why doesn't change the impact. Or the need for things to be different moving forward. Different how? She asked, wariness returning to her voice. No more comparisons. No more dismissing my type of intelligence because it's different from Kate's. No more Kate was always the academically gifted one comments to family and friends. She frowned. You're asking me to change how I see you. I'm asking you to see me, I corrected. Not as a reflection of Kate or a continuation of your story with Aunt Judith, but as Emily, with my own unique forms of intelligence that are valuable on their own terms. My mother didn't agree, but she didn't refuse either. As we cleared breakfast dishes in silence, I understood that this conversation wasn't a resolution but a beginning, the first honest acknowledgement of a dynamic that had shaped both our lives. The reckoning had finally begun. 1 year later, I stood before a different audience in a different backyard. Fairy lights twinkled in the early evening darkness, illuminating the faces of friends, professors, and family gathered to celebrate the launch of Perspective, the media visualization studio I had founded with 2 classmates from my communications program. The idea began in Professor Chen's media analysis class. I explained, clicking to the next slide in my presentation. We realized that the gap between data complexity and accessibility was growing, and traditional presentation methods weren't bridging it effectively. From the corner of my eye, I could see my mother sitting between Kate and Aunt Judith, her expression attentive but unreadable. She had arrived this morning, her first visit to my campus since I'd started college. Our approach combines rigorous analysis with intuitive visual design, I continued, advancing through examples of our work, including the expanded project for my cousin Michael's company, which had become our first paying client. We're not simplifying complex information. We're making its complexity navigable. As I fielded questions afterward, Professor Chun approached with the dean of the communications school. Emily's studio exemplifies the kind of innovative thinking we're developing in our program, he told the dean loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Her analytical framework for visual information design is genuinely groundbreaking. My mother, standing now at the refreshment table, tilted her head slightly, listening. I realized, with an intensity that suggested she was trying to reconcile this academic praise with her long-held narrative about my intelligence. The years since our Thanksgiving confrontation had brought gradual rather than dramatic change. My mother still occasionally slipped into comparative language, still sometimes dismissed my academic path as less rigorous than Kate's. But each time, I calmly reinforced the boundaries we had discussed, neither accepting her framing nor engaging in argument about it. Kate had become an unexpected ally in this process, gently redirecting conversations when they veered into familiar patterns, highlighting my accomplishments in ways our mother couldn't dismiss, refusing to participate in the comparative dynamic that had once defined our relationship. Now, as guests mingled in the warm May evening, Kate approached with a glass of sparkling cider. "Impressive presentation. Professor Wilson looks completely smitten with your work." I laughed. "He's been an amazing mentor. This launch wouldn't have happened without his support. And without your vision," she added firmly. "Mom's been quiet, but I think she's processing. Several faculty members have cornered her to rave about your exceptional analytical framework and innovative methodology. Technical terms always impress her," I observed wryly. "True, but it's more than that." Kate nodded toward where our mother stood chatting with Professor Chun. "I think she's seeing you through others' eyes for the first time, instead of through her own preconceptions." Later, as the party wound down, my mother helped me collect empty glasses and fold chairs. We worked in companionable silence until she paused, holding a stack of napkins. "Your professor mentioned you've been invited to present at the Media Innovation Conference," she said cautiously. "That sounds significant." "It is," I confirmed. "Only a few undergraduate projects were selected." She nodded, folding a napkin with precise movements. "You've built something impressive here, Emily." The words were simple but delivered without qualification or comparison. A straightforward acknowledgement that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Thank you," I said, equally simple. "I've been thinking about our conversation last Thanksgiving," she continued, not meeting my eyes. "About intelligence and how I've defined it." She set the napkins down carefully. "I may have been working with an outdated model." Coming from my mother, this admission was seismic. Not quite an apology, but a significant shift in perspective. "Models can be updated," I offered, matching her careful tone. "New evidence leads to revised conclusions. That's how good analysis works." A small smile flickered across her face at my deliberate use of academic language. "Yes, I suppose it is." We continued cleaning in silence for several moments before she spoke again. "Your aunt shared some old photos recently. From when you were about 6 or 7. She hesitated. "You had created an elaborate system for categorizing your books, not alphabetically or by subject, but by some complex framework involving colors, themes, and characters that cross between stories." I remembered that system vaguely, how it had made perfect sense to me but confused everyone else. "Judith said she'd never seen anything like it," my mother continued. "That it demonstrated a kind of systemic thinking most children your age couldn't grasp. She called it remarkably intelligent." The memory hung between us, my aunt recognizing a form of intelligence that my mother had overlooked, the parallel to her own childhood dynamic with Judith almost too perfect. "I think," she said carefully, "I may have missed some things. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a complete rewriting of our history, or a magical transformation of our relationship. But it was an opening, a small fragile space where new understanding might grow." That night, as Kate and my mother prepared to drive back to their hotel, I hugged them both goodbye. Kate's embrace was warm and familiar, but my mother's felt different, less perfunctory, more present. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, the words so quiet I almost missed them. I didn't need them anymore. Not the way I once had. My sense of self no longer depended on her assessment or approval, but I recognized them for what they were. Not just acknowledgement of my achievements but recognition of me, the daughter who would never be as smart as her sister, because she was smart in her own distinct and valuable way. As I watched their car pull away, I thought about the Emily from a year ago, standing frozen by the punch bowl as her mother's words cut through her hard-won confidence. That Emily had needed external validation to counter her mother's dismissal. This Emily, founder, innovator, strategic thinker, knew her worth from the inside out. The renewal wasn't about proving my mother wrong. It was about reclaiming the right to define my own intelligence on my own terms. About breaking a generational pattern of comparative judgment and narrow definitions of worth. As I turned back to my celebration, my achievement, my future, my path, I carried that knowledge like a compass, pointing always toward the truth I had discovered for myself. There are many ways to be brilliant. Mine was just one of them, and it was more than enough.